Welcome to another edition of Fragments of Rock. In the past, we've dealt with people like Mark Bolan, Rick Wakeman, John Cale. It's been so many artists. Oh, that must forget some chicken. This time, we've got a very special one because we've got a special guest and a bit of a celebration to do with Extravaganza. Guest in Ashley Franklin. Welcome.
Hello. Hi.
Long time since we worked together.
Yeah, in fact, 50 years ago, because I actually, in October of this year, celebrate my 50th year as a broadcaster. But then I was only 16. I won a Radio Nottingham DJ competition. And although it wasn't part of the prize were actually 2 rather mediocre rock albums, which I think I sold later. I was offered the chance to co-host the rock show while I was still at school. So I got Wednesday afternoon off when we did sport. And of course, the program went out live on a Saturday morning. So we didn't even pre-record the show. Yeah.
Having said that,
yeah.
The one we're going to have today is Roxy Music.
Yeah.
And ENO. Now, Island Records came to me and said, would Radio Nottingham like to host a concert? Radio Nottingham said, we don't do that sort of thing. So the £125 fee, I think it was 125, stop me if I'm wrong, was paid by Trent Polytechnic. They hosted it.
Right, yeah. Well, I do remember the gig, and I do remember the interview.
So we both went to Trent Polytechnic.
Yeah.
To see, and it was a polytechnic there, not the university.
It was Trent Poly, wasn't it? Yeah.
Poly, that's it. To see Roxy Music, and I dealt with Island Records, who said, I said, I need to have a guest coming in on Extravaganza the next morning, and I said Brian Ferry, and they said, get you Brian Eno. I remember we were sitting in the studio. I remember it very well. We're sitting in the studio, and they were slightly late because Rik Kenton was coming with him. More about him in a moment. And we were thinking, are they going to turn up? Are they not? And then they did. And the result. Well, here's part of the result.
With us today, live in the studio, we have Roxy Music, ENO, the demon of effects on synthesizer and tapes, and bass player Rik Kenton. Rik, born, weaned, nurtured and educated here in Nottingham. First of all, welcome to the programme. It's nice to see you here without any makeup on. What? Is this normal? What? You're not wearing any makeup?
What do you think that
is? he is wearing makeup, everybody. How did you feel it went last night?
Oh, splendidly. It was so lovely. I thoroughly enjoyed playing at Nottingham. And I found a nice music shop this morning that's converted my voice to a trumpet sound, as you can hear.
What's been the general reaction on the tour so far?
It's been very good.
Splendid. We've sold out everywhere.
Now, the tour's been delayed by Brian Ferry's tonsil operation, and by now you would have been in America. Is the tour of the States still going ahead?
Yeah, we start in about 2 weeks' time, I think on the 1st of December. It lasts for about 3 weeks.
How do you view the prospects of conquering America?
Well, we'll go there, being bottom of the bill, as we started doing that in England. You want to do that in the States.
In Britain, you had a lot of publicity when you emerged, but with America, you probably find yourself in a different situation that, to most American audiences, you'll just be a name.
Well, yeah, to a great degree. I think the
like
record...
Columbus, I mean, he was only a name when he went over, wasn't he? And he was bottom of the bill, I think, after Amerigo Vespucci.
Who?
Amerigo Vespucci. He actually discovered America.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Well, Eric the Red actually discovered America, but there's not really much historical evidence for that.
We're going to discover America soon.
Mm-hmm.
I think the record's taken off over there. It's on an underground basis.
No, the single or the LP?
Well, but I think they've both been released at the same time.
After last night's performance, it's hard to believe that an evening's ever gone wrong for you. But have you ever died a death on the stage?
Oh, yes.
Yes, many times.
You have?
Yes, well, in our early days, when our equipment wasn't so well organised as it is today, or should I say was even less well organised than it is today, a lot of gigs went wrong because we do rely heavily on complex sound equipment. I mean, there are 6 musicians for a start who play up to 3 instruments each. So, like, there's, I believe, well, we use a 20-channel mixer, which means there's at least 500 or 600 possible weak links in the equipment, you see. And before we could actually afford to employ a competent road staff, numerous gigs were messed up by equipment just failing, you know.
Did you have the audience hostile, or was it just...
Not really, no. I mean, the thing that it did to us was that it ruined our confidence at the time. It wouldn't do that now, because I think we could cope with the situation if it occurred. But at the time, it didn't help our confidence at all, because we had a fairly strict idea of how the set should sound, and if it didn't come out sounding like that, then we were quite disturbed, and not then in a position of confidence enough to improvise with what we could do.
Wow, that's that's quite a sort of a message for all young people starting out, isn't it? That even the people in our class is great are learning on the job a little bit.
You know what amazes me listening to that is I was chatting to Brian Eno as if he was just a normal guy. And he was at the time, in some senses. He'd only just broken through in Roxy Music. And yet I think if he stepped into the pub I was in, I would be in awe of the guy because he's one of the most charismatic figures in the world of music today. And yet it was still a big moment for me talking to somebody like Brian Eno, because I saw the band that night at Trent Poly. It was November 17th, 1972. So for this wet behind the ears teenager, it was a big moment because, Roxy Music were probably the most exciting band of that time. And I still think their first album was their classic. So listening back to this interview, almost gave me goosebumps.
When you actually look at the album cover and you see the picture of Eno, is that Eno?
Yeah.
He's pretty imposing even then, wasn't he?
Yeah.
With the makeup on and
but he very nicely spoken, well brought up, and endlessly fascinating, because when he left Roxy Music shortly after and struck up a solo career, I remember going to the King's Hall at Derby to interview him on his first solo tour, and he gave me a good half an hour, you might recall, and he was utterly charming and just such an interesting character. I mean, there he is talking about Columbus and Eric the Red.
Well, because he came in, and there's two Nottingham connections with this interview. He came in with Rik Kenton.
Yeah,
that was a bit of a surprise to us because he hadn't been in the original recordings, and then suddenly this guy appears on stage playing bass, and we were there, and we found out he's from Nottingham, and so well, obviously we had to pursue the fact of Rik Kenton was from Nottingham. We also had to pursue the fact that I was going to ask a completely and utterly stupid question, but I think naive and rude.
Do you regret your education? I mean, it was a very good school to go to. It's a very highly respected school here. Do you think it was a waste of time now you're in pop music?
No. If I hadn't had that education, I wouldn't be in pop music now. I mean, it all reflects back on what I did. I don't think it was a great school. They made me do woodwork instead of. I wanted to do art, and I ended up doing woodwork. But I liked it. I liked the school. I thought it was a friendly school.
Is it true you formed a band when you were at school?
Oh yeah, it's more with that sort of school friends.
Yeah.
A group called the Houndogs, which is a sort of rock and roll sort of group.
Don't laugh. The Houndogs. You did quite a lot of professional engagements with them, didn't you?
No, sort of semi-professional because I was still at school and I was at work.
With Herman's Hermits?
Well, we did play with the Hermits. It was in Birmingham, in fact. Well, we used to play with a lot of big groups like the Animals, and it was a very good experience to meet sort of very professional groups.
When did you join Roxy Music, and how did it all come about?
Well, I joined Roxy Music this year in May, and it came about sort of a chance meeting. The original bass player, Graham, left after the album was made, and Pete Sinfield, who produced Roxy's album, I'd known him for quite some while. And he said that they were looking for a bass player, and I just went along and met the boys.
Perhaps you can trace us through your musical career before Roxy. It all started, I believe, when you began to mess about with tape recorders as a kid.
It did indeed, yes. Well, in fact, it started when I began to mess around with my own voice, really. I was interested in phonetic poetry, sound poetry, that is, and I began using a tape recorder first of all just as a kind of echo unit and as a means of recording a number of backtracks of my voice and then reading over the top of them. Then I found that you could do other interesting and intricate things with a tape recorder, and then, with a technological triumph rivaled only by the internal combustion engine, I invented the long delay echo unit, upon which I founded my career. Then, sometime after that, when I'd amassed a large number of tape recorders, I owned about 30 at one time, all of very poor quality, like just domestic tape recorders, that people had sold for £5 to me and things like that. I got interested in building one or two simple electronic devices through an interest in lights, actually, not in sound. And I built one or two simple electronic things. Then, when I joined Roxy in January 1971...
Yeah, how did you get involved with Roxy? Did you know Brian Ferry before Roxy
No,
formed?
well, what happened was that I used to tour universities and colleges, giving performances of my own and other modern composers' music, which was predominantly electronic music, or music with some electronics involved somewhere. And at one stage I worked at a festival in Reading with Andy Mackay, you see, who at that time was also in electronic music. Then we didn't see each other again for 3 or 4 years, and he joined Roxy about a week before I did, with a synthesizer that he'd already bought. And he joined originally to play synthesizer, but they found, Brian and Graham found that he was a much better horn player, and so they needed someone to play synthesizer. And then Andy remembered me and they called on me.
We've got another Roxy Music track set up, Lady Tron. Now, I asked you before we actually put the needle in the groove which track you wanted to hear, and you said Lady Tron. Why?
Well, because it's a technological triumph rivaled only by the telescope, I think. No, it's a wonderful track.
You can't hear the track, of course, because of legal requirements. But I had to leave out plugging because he's just a natural, isn't he?
Yeah, and isn't it fascinating hearing how Brian Eno had 30 tape recorders and eventually began experimenting with sound using his voice? Wouldn't you love to have been a fly on the wall hearing the time he came up with this, as he says, long delay echo unit? And if anything, you know, he became even more creative and experimental. He was one of the most exciting musicians and musical thinkers on the planet. And yet, poor old Rik Kenton, you know, is not even on Wikipedia.
Yeah, I did find something on Wikipedia. And he joined Roxy Music in June '72 and was fired in December of the same year. Following a short-lived solo career in the mid-1970s, he became involved in the synth pop scene in the late 1970s. And on the departure from the band, he chose to disband the group in 1984 and began playing as a session musician. He has subsequently appeared with many acts, including, and then it goes on and on like that.
Oh, right. So, in fact, he got sacked barely a month after we spoke to him, and he never went to America with the band.
Sounds like it, no.
No, and he never actually played, I don't think, on any of their... He certainly didn't play on any of their albums.
And I've got his one single there.
Yeah.
On Island Records, Bungalow Love. Rik Kenton.
By Rik Kenton.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, so we've got to finish off finish the Roxy music. And what happened was he mentioned another person from Nottingham who was very important in his career. Richard Williams, who used to write for the Evening Post and then gone on to other things. I mean, Richard's been a guest on my program in the past. And perhaps we ought to have him on this program sometime talking.
Yes, Brian Eno does mention Richard Williams as helping them, in fact, at the beginning of their career.
That's right.
Eno, the interesting thing about the release of that first LP was that it came after you only played a handful of gigs. Now that's a rather unorthodox way for a group to emerge.
Yes, well, actually, most of the things about our history have been quite unorthodox in that we didn't intend to go on the road until we could afford to go on the road in style, really. And without releasing an album, it's quite difficult to do that. I mean, we simply didn't want to scrabble around in a squalor.
You were very lucky.
Many months.
You were very lucky with the publicity you got at the time. Were you banking on this publicity due to this fact that you put out a record and the audiences hadn't had a chance to hear the band?
Well, we did have a fair amount of publicity and attention beforehand. Richard Williams picked us up about the July before last and wrote an article about us in Melody Maker, and this was when we were very, very young as a group and very unformed. And then John Peel had us on his show a couple of times, so that we assumed that there was going to be a fairly good reaction, since we'd all always admired those two as critics, you know.
This blaze of publicity and also this camp rock image, do you think you were lucky not to have an outrage of public opinion putting you down as pretentious?
Well, any such outrage would always be quite useful anyway. I mean, outrages are always the best publicity, in fact. Witness most of the big bands of the last 10 or 15 years. So it wouldn't have
mattered which way it happened, you know.
Yeah, let's move away from the first LP and more to the future. I think it was you, who said that the next LP is going to be the cheapest album ever.
Yes, I think probably about £7.10. No, we do intend to make it cheap, actually. Partly this is a reaction against the first one, where we feel that some of the tracks were overproduced and lost some of their punch, shall we say, or rawness because of this.
Yeah, I preferred a lot of them as you did last night. I preferred to hear them live
certainly,
than on record.
Well, I mean, we're much more in a position now to do a cheap album because we can rely much more on our own resources rather than production techniques to produce a very good quality album now. I mean, we produce a sound on stage that should be as good as a recorded sound. I mean, we've got enough technology to make a very, very competent and complex sound on stage, and it should be a question on the next album of going to the studio and virtually playing numbers straight.
Yeah, there's also rumours that you're going to try and create the sort of sound they used to get in the past, as if, I think Brian Ferry said, like as if it was recorded in a fish and chip shop.
That's right, yes. So
well, the rock tracks will be like that, you know.
Mm-hmm.
We did some things for the BBC, BBC, and at sort of various studios in London. While we've been on the road, I mean, we played for like a week, and then we've done a radio show, and we've put the tracks down on the first take, and they've got all the excitement there, which you tend to lose if you're in the studio all day trying to do a track.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, with the, you know, that's all it is, because even if there are mistakes there, you can hide them away. You know, it's better to do that and have a really punchy song than
for
go
the
back.
atmosphere.
Well, yeah, you know, and go back and make it. Unless you've got 6 months to do it, unless you're like the Beatles. I mean, they had to do it. You know, we don't have to make our albums note perfect.
So there we are. Interesting, the mention of Richard Williams, who, as we all know, John, was a journalist at the Nottingham Evening Post. I think he then went on to be one of the chief writers of Melody Maker.
Right.
And I used to buy Melody Maker. He was my favourite rock journalist.
That's right. And he introduced two bands to me, and one, well, I'll never forget, because I'd never heard of the guy. He said, this guy's going to be really big. His name's Bruce Springsteen.
Well.
Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band, isn't it? And Rosalita. And I'll never forget that moment. He was wrong. It's been great working with you again. We must do it again. And we must find a way of celebrating 50 years of Extravaganza.
We'd love to. I'd love to.
There'll be further editions of Fragments of Rock, of course. But if you've got any questions for Ashley and myself, do pass them on to us. And Ashley and I would like to hear about any ideas you may have for celebrating 50 years, a golden, I can't believe this young program is now 50 years old, a way of celebrating with a concert or something. Who should we bring along as guests? Do get in touch with us. More Fragments of Rock coming up.